Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. I am Amin Yazdani, Director of Canadian Institute for Safety, Wellness, and Performance, host at Conestoga's College's School of Business, and the host for today's webinar. The webinar is co-hosted by the Center for Research on Work Disability Policy, Canadian Stand Association Group, as well as the Canadian Institute for Safety, Wellness, and Performance. We are so fortunate to have three amazing panelists today, who in fact are the active members of CSA Technical Committee for the development of Canadian Work Disability Management System as standard, and each represent a stakeholder group. Our panelists today will share their perspective on the implication of this standard for Canadian employers. Our panelists include Dr. Betty Norizekia, who is an occupational therapist and assistant professor at the University of Toronto. He hosts the inaugural Emily Goseller Grant Early Career Professor in Workplace Mental Health at the University of Toronto. He has expertise in biomechanics, occupational therapy, clinical anatomy, and work disability management related to mental health. Bechtin applies a biopsychosocial lens to design solutions for identifying and assessing risk and preventing or improving high-risk behaviors in the workplace. Sari Sarnana, a National Health and Safety Director at Unifor. She's responsible for the content of health safety training programs, submissions for better laws, information on workplace substances, and establishment of programs to eliminate hazardous workplace condition, and the publication of the Health and Safety Environment newsletter. Sari participates in several key committees across Canada. And Maureen Han, President and the CEO of the Canadian Council on Rehabilitation and Work. The Canadian Council on Rehabilitation and Work is the only national organization with the sole vision of equitable and meaningful employment for people with disabilities. Under Maureen's leadership, CCRW has seen an increase in direct program service through Canada, as well as more transparent streamlining of understanding the business case of hiring a person with disability. And also we have Lena Lopez, who is the project manager from CSA. She joined us today with years of experience in the standard development, and she will be the moderator for the QA session of this webinar. Well, we start today's presentation with Lena Lopez to provide an overview of CSA's standard development process. Following Lena's presentation, I will provide a high-level overview of the standard. We have presented 3 questions to our panelists, and they will speak to these questions following my presentation. And then if you have any questions, please use the QA function to ask your questions, and we will get to them at the end of this webinar and through our QA session moderated by Lena. All right, so now let's learn about CSA's standard development process by Lena Lopez.
Good afternoon or good day, everyone. I'm Lena. I'm going to provide you with a quick overview on CSA's standard development process. So providing 2 minutes of what often takes a good 12 months to develop. So a quick overview about CSA Group. CSA is an independent, non-governmental organization, and there's 2 divisions to the organization. On the right, if you're looking at the slide, there's a commercial area. That's where testing, inspection happens, and is often a very external side that you become familiar with because of the CSA mark. On the left-hand side, it's the standards development organization, the not-for-profit side, and that's where the standards development takes place. Move into the next slide. So with the standards development organization, this takes place, we look at 12 focus areas, and this particular standard was developed within the lens of occupational health and safety. So one of the areas of focus, And of course, this particular standard it actually overlaps into many areas. So we'll go to the next slide. And the standard here is the Z1011, and it was published in 2020. So Work Disability Management System. This particular standard is one standard in a suite of management system standards. It falls under, again, the occupational health and safety, but also because of the framework, it also is applicable to many of the areas of focus and also into worker wellness. The next slide, I'm going to provide you with a quick overview on the standard development process, should you not be familiar with how does a standard get developed. So to go through this, there's a chart that's on the screen, and it often looks like a board game. So what happens before a standard gets developed, it looks at either an individual organization has brought forward a proposal about the idea of developing some consistency in an area. So that is where notification goes out to determine if there is any standard in this field of work, and recognizing that if there's not, and in this particular area of the standard, there wasn't any standards developed under these standards, the standards, the SEC, the Canadian Standards Association. So with that, that's where meetings developed, and that was developed through consensus. A group of individuals from different areas came together to really look at developing a standard. Once that standard was put together into a draft, it went out for public inquiry. So that public inquiry went out to the public to provide an overview and to find out what the public is thinking about the draft. And then after a couple of iterations, then it went out to public, it actually was publicly released. So that's where we're at right now. The standard is available to the public, and we're looking at maintenance. So this standard will be reviewed for the next 5 years. And this is where individuals can submit requests for interpretation if there's anything unclear or anything that they're looking to have answered about the standard. Go to the next slide. So a question we often get at CSA is, well, why is the standard adopted, or how do you decide on a standard being adopted? So CSA being non-governmental, it doesn't decide which standard to adopt, but what happens is the government often will look at it and recognize that it's a best practice in the area. It was also developed through consensus and with individuals around the table. Now this is a virtual space, but typically in the past, a table where you have different various inputs from different areas. The other question we often get is, well, how do you get involved? How, if you're interested in becoming part of a committee, how do you get started? So an area to get started is that CSA has a community of interest board that posts calls for participation. So there you can determine on how to participate or what committees are looking for members, as well as you're able to provide input on any draft standards that I've mentioned that take place during public review, and that's open for 60 days. So there's an opportunity there, as well as CSA Group has a CSA research arm, and there's an opportunity there to get involved in research. So those are ways to get involved. If you have any questions following, feel free to always contact me at CSA, and I'll provide my email later on in the question and answer period. Thank you.
Thank you, Lena. So now let's look at what this standard is all about and learn about some important aspect of this standard. Well, 1 in 5 Canadians, according to Statistics Canada, have one or more type of disabilities, and the issues around unemployment and underemployment of people with disabilities is a significant global issue that has enormous negative impact on the economy. For instance, the annual cost of work disability alone is estimated at $1.2 trillion worldwide. There are some recent estimates of the cost of exclusion that identify the total Canadian burden at about $337 billion. That is about 17.6% of Canada's GDP. across all social domains with the productivity and output cost of about $62.2 billion. So add to this the current trend in developed countries and the prevalence of chronic and episodic disabilities that is increasing with the aging of labor force, again, especially in developed countries. So what have we done to address this important issue? Have we been able to educate our employers and leaders and decision makers within organizations to address this global issue? But despite overwhelming the amount of guidance and practices out there and great work that has been done so far, still work disability management in many organizations is varied, piecemeal, and often not based on organizational-wide approaches. Therefore, there is a need to incorporate best practices in work disability prevention into management systems and day-to-day operations so that it becomes a part of organizations' day-to-day operation. Because that's how we can bring employees and decision makers recognize the importance of this issue. So this standard focuses on promoting proactive approaches towards work disability, highlighting the importance of organizational strategy to address this issue before the onset of work disability, and also promotes hiring and retaining people with disability. The standard includes strategies to accommodate workers in order to prevent unnecessary absence, and also information on earlier safe return to work when health absences occur. When we look at the work disability management system, we're looking at a continuum from primary to secondary through to tertiary prevention, as this approach is known to be most effective strategy. And again, we're looking at the hiring and retaining people with disability as also a fundamental aspect of this standard, and looking at managing worker health over their employment cycle within the organization. The scope of the standard is to provide a framework for management of work disability at the organizational level, looking at, again, some interventions at the organizational level, and it specifies the requirement for a work disability management process to support organizations regardless of size and sector. So let me walk you through, again, some important aspect of this standard. As you see, this standard is organized into two main sections: content, which outlines the requirements, and informative annexes, which are non-mandatory guidance material to further support organizations to implement this standard and better guide them to meet the requirements. In this section of this standard, I will call them the key requirements section of this standard, you will learn about the key requirements of this standard and how it fits within the Plan, Do, Check, Act model of management system. We chose Plan, Do, Check, Act model because that allows seamless integration to an organizational wide model to address existing business challenges. So what you do is that you start implementation by understanding and by demonstrating that there is commitment from senior management, and that senior management provides leadership necessary to ensure the success of the system, ensuring that the responsibilities of all the stakeholders are outlined, the roles of people with disabilities, injured workers are outlined, and resources are in place to make sure that your program is sustainable and successful. And overall organizational policy needs to be also developed and communicated and also enforced through the organization and set baseline necessary to measure success and failure. So if you do not have the baseline data, you don't really know if your program is successful or not. So we recognize that organizations may already have some sort of a work disability management process. So we don't expect organizations to start everything from scratch. So you may have existing programs in place that may well fit into the requirement of this standard. So don't reinvent the wheel. So see and learn from what you have in place and see how it responds to the requirements of this standard, and then identify those gaps and then set your objectives and targets. you need to understand that the expectation around implementing the standard in a short period of time is practically impossible. So you need to have a plan in place within 2 or 3 years, be able to implement most part of the standard based on the gaps that you identify. You should have a continuous improvement plan in place. And again, as I said, no one expects you to go from 0 to 100 in a single year or a short period of time. The key here is that this is not a one-person job. You should not expect a disability case manager within the organization or HR professional, health and safety person within the organization to do this. You must engage with all internal stakeholders, including people with disabilities, including an injured person, and most importantly, again, as I said, management and workers representative to be able to implement this program or a standard. The system is designed to work if all stakeholders are engaged. So make sure to lay the foundation right before starting the process. So when your planning is complete and you have sets of objectives, then you go about engaging with relevant external stakeholders if needed. Then you enter into implementation phase, keeping in mind your priorities may change as organizations may go through unexpected challenges. A good example is the public pandemic, COVID-19, that you're all somehow impacted. So it is important to have an open mind and be flexible and go through the implementation phase and implement objectives and targets. Again, keeping that in mind that again, some unexpected situations may change your priorities. Then you want to make sure that you evaluate what works, what doesn't work, how to improve your program further, what can you learn from your mistakes, how things have changed in terms of outcome, and any process-related challenges that organizations may have in implementing this standard. All of these are important, and the key is that you have senior management support to ensure proper resources are in place and prioritized in a continuous improvement model. So again, collaborate with all internal stakeholders, and you want to make sure that your evaluation of the system is realistic and accurate. So that was kind of what the standard discusses when it comes to the key aspect of the requirement. But the standard also discusses the employment cycle and expects organizations to implement the management system, taking into consideration the employment cycle of a person with disability. The standard highlights the work disability management as a continuum in terms of managing worker health over their time with the organization, from recruitment, hiring, and onboarding, to job continuity and advancement and eventual departure from the organization. The standard also provides additional guidance on what to look in each phase and what factors to consider for seamless integration of persons with disability in your organizations. In addition to those requirements, the standard also discusses how to develop a business case for implementing work disability management. Like any other organizational activity, you need to be justifying a business perspective of why the implementation of work disability management system is important. This is true whether the organization is for-profit or non-for-profit organization, or an organization in private or public sector, or either small or large. The Annex A of the standard provides a guidance on preparing business case to help sell the idea of developing a work disability management system by adopting this standard. The business case should include information on reduced risk of costly disability-related human risk from financial losses, looking into how that would help optimizing management, workforce productivity, and business continuity, and also the positive impact it has on staff morale and loyalty, reducing the risk of human rights litigations, and also positive effect on workers' personal lives. And the standard also outlines some guiding principles, as you see here in this slide, that looking to providing some important guiding principles that you need to consider when you're implementing the standard. But most importantly, one of these guiding principles looking to joint responsibility between organization management, worker and worker representatives throughout the process. When it comes to hiring people with disability, there are perhaps some kind of barriers that you may face, and again, some of the those it would be are related to accommodating workers with disability and recruitment and hiring and onboarding. You want to ensure that the policies that they put in place consider each worker's ability to perform the essential duties of the job, establishing a worker career development review process that is flexible and promotes ongoing learning for workers with disabilities, and also making sure that the worker is able to perform the essential duties of the job. You want to also make sure that you monitor and evaluate the whole process and making sure that your accommodation practices are being implemented effectively. One of the important guiding material within this is an annex on systematic barriers and unconscious bias. Unconscious bias are social stereotypes or attitudes towards a group that people hold without the conscious awareness that the people use to quickly process information and make decisions. So unconscious bias can lead to discrimination and exclusion, and thus could result in an organizational being unable to reach its fullest potential. So to make sure that you avoid unconscious bias, the standard highlights some important recommendations as you see in this slide, making sure that you foster an inclusive workplace that values diversity. You want to identify the most important areas to address first, because again, as I said, it may take you time to figure out what kind of actions you need to put in place. So you want to make sure that you focus on the most important areas and continually work to improve policies, programs, and practices. You want to also encourage managers and workers to better understand how and when unconscious bias manifests itself, and also encourage managers and workers to discuss and identify the issues related to unconscious bias. So you have to have that collaborative approach to identify those issues. And also making sure that the training program is sensitive enough to address unconscious bias that anyone might have, improve communication with organization to transfer knowledge of best practices in mitigating unconscious bias, and also establishing the hiring, compensation, onboarding, promoting policies and processes to counter the effect of unconscious bias. So I tried to go over a few considerations for employers that could be instrumental in implementing this standard. So now let's hear from our panelists, and we'll see what they believe are the implications of this standard for persons with disability. We'll start first with Maureen Hahn, the President and CEO of the Canadian Council on Rehabilitation and Work. And we want to hear about her experience and what she believes are the implications of this standard for persons with disability. And for that reason, we presented 3 questions to Maureen, and Maureen will speak to them.
Thanks so much, Min. It's wonderful to hear your voice. As I look at my picture, I recognize that I probably should have gotten you one that had a better pixel content to it. I don't usually look that pixelated in real life, although, you know, during COVID, it's pixels, I guess, are part of life. So, but thank you very much for inviting me here today. It was an honor to work. I was on the technical committee of this standard, and so it was quite an exciting time to be involved with the standard, because really what we wanted to do was ensure that that people with disabilities, and as you've spoken about, it is the full life cycle of work. And so I'll go through the questions, though, that as they're posed. So I think that in our experience at CCRW and what we've heard from our partners as well, the top 3 key challenges that persons with disabilities really face in getting and keeping a job in Canada. The first one has to be bias. It's a bias of the employers and of the businesses that feel that the person with a disability just cannot do the job. So we need to continue to work with businesses and employers to get them to understand that people with disabilities really bring innovation and diversity to the workplace, that lived experience on its own can be a critical benefit to a company. If the talent the company is looking for has to do with ensuring that that there are 8 different pathways to success, and that if one pathway is blocked, that somebody can pivot easily and figure out a different pathway, well, then maybe somebody with lived experience of trying to figure out and navigate getting to work in on public transit, or trying to figure out what to do if their battery for their wheelchair has died, or trying to figure out what to do if your hearing aid batteries have failed, or, you know, so many different life experiences. And so I think that that's really what we have to try and overcome, and that definitely is the biggest burden I find. The other 2 kind of distant forerunners, or backrunners, I would say, would be appropriate self-advocacy and understanding of disability and what accommodations are actually required to do the job. And I think that to overcome this, we would have to work with secondary and post-secondary institutions to ensure that people with disabilities have a different experience of disability outside of learning. I quite often get the people with disabilities quite often know exactly what it is that they need to succeed in a learning environment, a little bit more time on tests, or making sure to have the test questions in advance, etc. And maybe in a different room, in a quiet room, to do exams. But the problem is that those accommodations don't always work in the workplace. And so we have to look at what the job is of the workplace and accommodate appropriately. And that's up to us to really work with, again, secondary and post-secondary institutions. Sorry about that. To understand how we can best support people with disabilities on that road. And the last one is for people with disabilities to actually understand their own disability, but also their talents, looking past their disability and into the talent and that they have. I talked already about life experience, and really understanding what those transferable skills really are, and working in that area. So I'm going to move on. Actually, I'm going to answer the 3rd question first. And the 3rd question is the facets of the standard that I find particularly helpful for organizations seeking to better manage work disability. And I'm so proud that this standard includes recruitment and onboarding, because disability management systems are for full-time employees. And so, so to include recruitment and onboarding, I think is critical. It will create a disability confidence in businesses. And the idea here is to get people to disclose early and feel confident about disclosing. Quite often, people with disabilities feel that they've been discriminated against when they've been applying for jobs. And so they don't disclose their disability. And rightfully so, I completely understand that. So then when they go to an interview and they're asked, you know, do you need any accommodations? Are there any adjustments that you require? Quite often the answer is no, because they don't want to feel, they don't want to be discriminated against. So, but if we have a business that adopts this standard right at the beginning, then they do that frontward facing part that says we are a disability confident employer. So please do not disclose what your disability is, but what accommodations and adjustments you may need in order to get the work done properly. So I feel that that's probably the most exciting piece of the standard. And then going back up to the second question, then what the implications of this standard are for people with disabilities and the potential impact of implementing this standard for workers and employers. I think that, again, disclosing very early right at the very beginning of the employment cycle will then, the idea is that that may just lead to less stress on the disability management system in place later on. Quite often we hear about people with disabilities disclosing after their 3-month probationary period is up. But could you imagine how much better they would have done in that 3-month period if they had been accommodated right at the very beginning, if there was an accommodation that was needed, of course. So the idea here is that the earlier the disclosure happens, then the less stress is put on that disability management system later on. And the last piece, I think, the implications, I think, for the business world are that that diversity does include disability. So all of the diversity and inclusive inclusion committees, or the areas of wanting to make sure that the workforce is robust, that is able to handle the work, because again, as we know, Canada is not populating itself. And if we are looking outside of just immigration, then we are looking at our own populations. And if we've got 22% of the population of people with disabilities, that means that there is that diversity there in disability. So I think that that's the last piece, that really it shows a business confidence to be hiring people with disabilities and making sure that there is businesses then continue in a sustainable way with appropriate and diverse staff. So I think I'll leave it there. I hope I didn't go over my 7 minutes.
No, thank you so much, Maureen, and I believe your image is very nice here. There is not a problem with your the resolution. I think that's the only issues, but I couldn't find any better photo.
Thanks so much.
Resolution in the internet. But thank you so much, Maureen. I think it was very nice to hear your insightful perspective, and I'm sure that we'll have some questions for you at the end. Our next panelist is Sari Sairanan from Unifor. Sari, we're excited to hear your perspective on the questions that we presented to you.
Great, thanks very much. Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be on this panel, and I'll echo what Maureen said as well, that it was a thrill to work on the technical committee. I've worked on a few other technical committees with CSA, and these are really foundational pieces to be adopted into workplaces. And looking at the first question about those 3 challenges, I mean, to me, that's kind of a motherhood statement. Looking at that, is our world of work is changing. There is a lot more diversity, recognition of diversity in our communities. Unifor doesn't hire. We graciously accept the employees that our collective agreements recognize and bring them into the fold. And then looking at that joint culture in the workplace, how to ensure that everyone feels that they are participating equally in the workplace, that there is a recognition of their talents. And Maureen really eloquently talked about that, is that equity face in the workplace. And how are we accommodating each of us to our talents in the workplace? And that's really one of those key challenges in the workplace, is ensuring that everyone is feeling psychosocially that they are participating in the workplace, that they're getting satisfaction, as well as that huge impact of, am I contributing? All of us want to feel that we are contributing to our workplaces. That's our identity. And so how do we ensure that the workplace culture keeps evolving? And that's where we, over the years with our employers through collective agreements, are looking at how do we continue evolving that workplace culture? And how are we reflective of what's happening in society at large? And how is that cultural adaptation, evolution happening in the workplace as well? Over the years, we've bargained many joint programs into workplaces, and we find that the joint programs are very effective. The employer has one relationship with its employees, the union has another relationship with its members, and how do you combine those relationships to have success in the workplace, to ensure everyone feels that they are included in that workplace culture? And that challenge is continuously there. We conducted an equity audit about 3 years ago. As an organization, we went across the country, and the audit captured about 80% of our members across the country. And we learned some pretty hard lessons. It's sometimes difficult to look at yourself in the mirror, and that's what workplaces need to do as well, is look at yourself in the mirror of, how am I actually reflecting what is happening reality-wise in my workplace, and how are we able to evolve from that? How are we able to enhance ourselves in our workplaces? And it's that quality of working life, workplace culture, the accommodation that's happening in the workplace. One of the key messages we got from our members was lead by example. Is how are you ensuring that there is great participation? Are you listening to everyone in the workplace, equally listening, as well as providing those education opportunities that not everyone learns the same way? Of how do you recognize that? How do you recognize that I'm going to be successful in the venture? And the framework is evolving. How are we evolving with that equity framework in our workplaces? And also looking at, do you know your workforce? Have you done that survey of your workforce? So those are really key challenges. And that's why the CSA standard is such a great tool for workplace parties to look at, because it is a roadmap for you to ensure that you are meeting those key challenges. And why are you not meeting those key challenges? And some of the other lessons that we learned through that equity survey is looking at celebrating diversity in our workplaces. We're always looking at the negative side of things, and it's really celebrating and how are we all contributing to the successes of the organization. Whatever that success may look like, but it is that collective view. And that's why the CSA standard, not only in this format of looking at standards, management standards in the workplace parties are used to looking at CSA standard, whether it's electrical standard, robotic standards, those sort of technical side of it, But here you have an opportunity of, again, growing the understanding in the workplace of what are the best practices. And when I look at the standard, I always, yes, the front part of the standard is that shall and must and that kind of roadmap. But when you go into the appendix, that's where the participants on the technical committee have brought forward their best practices, their experiences from their workplace. So it's a wealth of information going to the appendix, looking at what are some of the challenges. And there is great examples, live examples given from workplaces of how you've tackled different scenarios, whether you're in housekeeping, whether you're in customer service, facing the public, working internally, and not having that public face to the world. But what are some of the practical experiences that the members shared, and looking at doing an audit yourself of how am I really taking the pulse of my workplace, instead of looking at lagging indicators of there's been issues that now need to be addressed, whether it's through grievances that have taken place, or it is because of benefit costs going up because issues haven't been addressed at the forefront. It's really ensuring that there's a prevention lens in the organization. The burden shouldn't be carried by individuals on their own. It is really an organizational change, and the individuals are part of that organization. And it's that collective effort. And that's what we always stress, that the collective agreement is a joint venture. It's the rules of engagement for the parties, and the standard is a huge part of that rules of engagement of ensuring we're all on that roadmap of inclusivity into our workplaces, and ensuring we're preventing any of the issues growing into systemic toxic workplaces, because those are the difficult ones to start rolling back. Have a preventive lens right from the beginning of how are we establishing our workplace culture, how are we going to deal with issues in the workplace. Everyone needs to know what the rules of engagement are, and this CSA standard will definitely give you some insight into what a positive roadmap is for everyone, for that inclusivity in the workplace. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Sorry, that was very insightful. And in fact, I want to highlight that how important workers and workers representatives and unions are in ensuring the successful implementation of this standard. Well, the next panelist is Dr. Bethin Zakia. Bethin, you come with both academic and clinical background. Tell us what you think.
Okay, can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great, thank you. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted to be a part of this panel with my esteemed colleagues, and also to see so much interest in this topic area. So I'm going to kind of provide you a perspective as a healthcare practitioner, and also as someone who does research in this area. So you can kind of see where my focus is when it comes to working with individuals with disabilities. So as an occupational therapist, I've worked with individuals with disabilities in the workplace for nearly 15 years, and that has included supporting individuals back to work, ensuring that their voices are heard, advocating on their behalf, educating various stakeholders, whether they're employees or employers or unions, associations, and other stakeholders as to the importance of inclusion, of engagement, and ensuring that individuals with disabilities have an important role to play in society, and that we should recognize that and to leverage their contribution to Canadian society. That's very important for us to consider, given that a couple of reports have come out in the last 10 years or so from the World Health Organization. If you're interested afterwards, I'm happy to share them with you. But the World Report on Disability came out in 2011, and it painted a very bleak picture of employment for individuals with disabilities. In fact, it found that many countries had substantially lower rates of disability, of employment when it came to their workforce and those that had disabilities. So, for example, Canada was around 56%, the employment rate for individuals with disabilities. That's compared to 74% for individuals in the overall population. So we were higher than countries like Poland or Peru, but we lagged others like Switzerland and the Scandinavian countries like Norway, which had rates in the high 60s and low 70s. So just to show you where we're sitting on a global stage, the second report that I like to bring to your attention, which highlights these three key challenges in terms of individuals working with disabilities and their inclusion in the workforce, is the Rehabilitation and Health Systems report that was also issued by the World Health Organization in 2017. And again, they reiterated from a health perspective the importance of individuals that have disabilities in accessing healthcare and how that is intimately tied to them being able to engage in paid occupation. So a couple of the highlights that I'll just present to you here today is that they found the individuals with disabilities were twice as likely to find inadequate healthcare and also have inadequate access to healthcare providers, regulated or unregulated. They were 3 times as likely to be denied healthcare, and they were 4 times as likely to be treated poorly by the mental health or healthcare system in general. So you can imagine that in addition to all the other challenges that they have, and as we heard from other panelists, they also have issues with health. And the reason why health is so important is that we know from the social determinants of health that health and employment go hand in hand. When you have somebody who is able to participate and to contribute meaningfully into what they do at work, that automatically leads to them having better health outcomes. Of course, there are exceptions. I'm speaking in very general terms, but that provides us with a landscape of what we're dealing with. From the implications of this standard, what's really important for us to remember is that as technical committee members, we want to use a very inclusive framework. We use something called the biopsychosocial framework, or one that doesn't just focus on impairment or using a medical model that looks at diseases and addressing the disease or the impairment, and then the issue is resolved. Rather, we're looking at this from a health perspective, a psychological or mental health framework, and also from a societal or sociological perspective, meaning that we're bringing expertise from many different areas, and you see that reflected in the technical committee. So no longer is it good enough to just have a family doctor or one other type of healthcare practitioner dictating the course of somebody's return to work, or whether or not they have a disability or not. In this case, we're talking about individuals with disabilities, but rather you want an inclusive framework that includes a lot of different expertise and perspectives, because that's what the research evidence is indicating, that we need to have this biopsychosocial framework that brings in the expertise that you're seeing on this panel. So those that are outside of healthcare, those are outside of the business community, in government, in unions, because each person has a very important contribution to make when it comes to supporting individuals with disabilities. And you see that reflected in the CSA Z1011. Finally, I'll close by telling you a little bit what facets I find most important about the standard. I think the most striking piece for me is that it doesn't put the onus no longer on the employee to make the initial move, to be able to say to the employer, this is something that I need help with, come and help me. It sees it as a joint collaborative approach where we're going to see the employer and the employee working together and in tandem to addressing these complex issues. And remember that when we're looking at and considering individuals with disabilities, not only do they have their health and medical complexities to deal with, but you're also dealing with litany of complexities and roadblocks in the workplace and getting access to the workplace that they have on top of everything else. So we do need a joint collaborative effort. We see that reflected in the standard. I'm extremely proud of it. I think that it focuses a lot more on an inclusive and participatory approach that is focused on engagement, on advocacy, on education, and one that looks at prevention and really focuses on working with individuals with disabilities to act as their allies in supporting them in any way we can. And just a final plug, as an occupational therapist, I'm delighted that we're seeing so much more emphasis and so much more attention being given to individuals that have disabilities and their engagement in the workplace. This is something that OTs have been advocating for many, many years, and this is something that we're finally seeing some fruition. And I want to recognize all the members here and many of the others that have put lots of hard work into bringing the standard to light. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Bethany, for your very informative views on this. It was very interesting, some of the numbers and some of the data that you shared with us. Now we have about 10 minutes for question and answers by Lina Lopez. Lina? Yes,
Good day, everyone. A couple of questions. I'm going to start with the first one. What is the role of support organizations such as CCRW in supporting people with disabilities to address their unemployment issues? So I'll send that question to Maureen.
Sure, it's a good question. I think that we need to, and I think that this was mentioned. I'm not too sure if it was by. Sorry. Oh, should I put my camera on? I'm sorry. I'm not too sure who had mentioned this, but that it's enough to have to only look at the person with the disability, right? Like we have to be looking at where they're working as well, and making sure that the emphasis is put on the employers as well, and put on the employment field and the businesses to make sure that they're disability confident. It's not only about the person with the disability being able to fix themselves to be able to get a job or to retain a job, right? So I think that it's up to agencies such as CCRW and our other partner agencies to make sure that we're supporting people with disabilities 100%, but that we're also supporting businesses and employers to make sure that they become disability confident.
Thank you. And to the participants, just want to remind you, you have an opportunity to submit a question through the Q&A feature on the Zoom, which you'll find the bottom hand of the screen. Another question received is the following: how do unions support and advocate for people hiring with disabilities? So sorry, I'll send that question over to you.
Yeah, well, as Maureen said, we want to ensure that the workplaces are successful once they've hired a diverse workforce, to ensure that the tools are there, that we as well as representatives are sensitive, are listening, and are ensuring that the collective agreement languages, the workplace joint programs, that they are reflective on an inclusive workforce. And that is a continuously evolving dialogue to have. And it's, as we've heard, that just by adopting the standard doesn't mean that the work gets done. It is an evolution. As the world of work keeps evolving, new technologies coming, new requirements come, and we've seen it during COVID of how telework, do you ensure that your workforce has the right tools to be able to work from home or wherever they may be. And so it's those dialogues continuously being at the forefront and preventing any negative outcomes. And that requires a lot of effort and foresight on all parties.
Thank you. Questions come in and it reads the following. And this is to all the panelists. Could our panelists comment on some of the differences between accommodating and supporting individuals with invisible disabilities as opposed to visible disabilities? So feel free to, whoever would like to start. And I can read it over again if you wish.
I'm happy to jump in. Maybe I can open the door to this. I think that that the supporting and accommodating individuals with invisible disabilities poses a challenge in a couple of ways. First, but the first one, and that's what I think we touched on earlier, is the disclosure. Quite often what happens is somebody with an invisible disability may not have disclosed. Quite often that's what we find, that there is no disclosure. And then once it becomes, once the disability is known, or once the way the disability is uncovered is because of a performance issue. And so now we've got a performance issue, and then it's a disclosure of a disability. And it's very, then it's very, very difficult. So I think that that's the first part of the conundrum, is around disclosure. But the flip side of that is that what we see is people with invisible disabilities don't want to disclose their disability because they don't feel that they're going to be believed. And so if they're not believed, then why would they trust in the first place? So I think that this is also where this standard can come into play, that there is kind of there is this standard, there is this understanding about how businesses should be reacting, not just to physical or visible disabilities, but also to invisible disabilities.
Thank you, Maureen. Would anyone else like to add?
Sure. I'll just add to the fact that, you know, from the evidence that's been collected, at least in terms of the research evidence, there's quite a few models that are well aligned with working with individuals that may have a disability that's not visibly apparent, whether it's a mental health or other type of disability. And I'm happy to talk about it. You know, it's outside of the scope here, but like supportive employment models and those kinds of approaches have been successful in addressing some of these concerns. But obviously, this is a fluid process. There's trust that's required. There's establishment of rapport and many other factors. But I think this is a very key and important role that all of us have to play on this panel in supporting that.
Yeah, I definitely agree with my panelist here that the relationship is really important in the workplace, to have that trust to ensure you have open dialogue, that you don't feel that you are going to be discriminated by bringing issues forward. And there's lots of different circumstances how a invisible disability will come about, changes in work process, or now being relocated to a different department, and suddenly the work is different. It changes, the elements change. So what's in the current work process or the work culture that gives you that nimbleness to continue those discussions? And you should be able to resolve those issues internally. Too often we have to bring third parties in to make those changes possible in the workplace, and that sends a whole different message to others in the workplace that will then hunker down and will say, "Ooh, I can't show anything else but what I have," and that does not bode for a very healthy work culture for the long term.
I just want to jump in here, Lena, as well, as that basically one of the issues is around distinguishing between visible disabilities from invisible ones, and that's something that unfortunately could be problematic in trying to accommodate individuals with invisible disabilities. But we did a study in 2015 looking at the evidence of workplace accommodation policies and practices for persons with visible disabilities. And we realized that many of the accommodations that they have been recommended for people with disabilities could potentially, I'm repeating it, potentially be useful for people with invisible disabilities. Again, I'm happy to share that paper with the audience as well, if there is a need. But this is a really, really interesting topic, which I believe we need to think about how to provide some more guidance in the revisions of this standard.
Thank you, Min. There's one last question here. And the question is, what are the roles of OT professionals in safe integration of people with disabilities in the workplace? So Beathin,
yeah, I think that might be to me, unless there's other OTs on the panel. I think that there's a lot of ways that OTs already work with individuals with disabilities and supporting them in the workplace. I mean, I can't possibly answer that, but I'll just give you an overview of what it's like. So it's everything from supporting their functional recovery and return to work. It's to advocate and communicate with different stakeholders. I think occupational therapists play a very unique role in the sense that we can talk to the healthcare practitioners and understand their lingo, but at the same time be able to converse with employers and other stakeholders that are involved in this process. We're dealing with a complex and sophisticated situation that oftentimes sees overlap of many different disciplines that don't traditionally interact with one another. So I think OTs have been playing leadership roles in this area and will continue to do so, whether it's on the work accommodation, the return to work, the disability management. But I think we can get a very comprehensive picture that way. And a lot of my research in this area, if you're interested, I'm happy to share with you, addresses different points, whether it's on the prevention side or the return to work side or the work disability side.
Thank you. Amin, I'm looking at the clock here and it reads 1 p.m. So I'll hand it over to you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. Again, I think we had a really good and fruitful conversation on this important topic. Our future webinars related to CSA Z1011 will happen in next year. You see here a full schedule. We'll be communicating with you via email or LinkedIn and other social media platforms. So if you would like to participate in any of these webinars, you can register. On behalf of Canadian Institute for Safety, Wellness and Performance and our partners, CRWDP and CSA Group, I would like to thank our panelists for their time and their generous support. I think these webinars and these knowledge dissemination activities and the support from people like the panelists today is very, very, very important to making sure that employees are aware of the responsibilities and they're aware of the standard and best practices in the area of work disability management system. Thank you so much for your time, and I will share with you the recording of webinar to our YouTube channel. So I will send everyone that registered for this webinar with the link to the YouTube channel. There they can actually view the recording of this webinar and previous and future webinars. Thank you so much.